Just after 5:30 in the evening on April 21st, 1930, a single candle, sitting in a pan of kerosene, finally caught, ending what had been, for everyone involved, an entirely ordinary spring day. It had been smoldering for close to an hour, tucked into a pile of oily rags on the roof of a 6-story cell block under construction in downtown Columbus, Ohio, waiting patiently for exactly this moment to finally arrive. Below that roof, packed into a building already holding nearly 3 times the number of men it had ever been designed for, 800 prisoners had just finished their evening meal and been marched back to their cells for the night. Within minutes of the fire finally taking hold, smoke was pouring down through the tiers. The men inside began screaming to be let out, and the guards, standing at the end of the block, keys in hand, made a decision that would define this building forever after. They did not open the doors. By the time the fire was finally brought under control, 322 men were dead, and more than 200 more were injured badly enough to require hospitalization. It remains, to this day, the deadliest prison fire in American history, and one of the deadliest building fires this country has ever recorded, a distinction it would hold for more than 80 years before a disaster in a Honduran prison finally surpassed it. A comparison that itself tells you how genuinely rare an event of this magnitude has been across the entire recorded history of institutional confinement worldwide. The men who died were locked in cells inside a prison built for 1,500 people. That was, on the night it burned, holding nearly 3 times that number, in a cell block whose own roof, weakened by the same fire, would eventually collapse and kill roughly half of them outright. This is the entire story of the Ohio Penitentiary, the single deadliest prison fire this country has ever recorded. If you find these stories worth telling, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely and truly helps keep this channel alive. Now, let's go back to 1834, to the year Columbus, Ohio, decided its old 13-cell town jail simply would not do anymore. Ohio's prison system, like the population it was built to serve, started small and never once stopped growing faster than anyone actually planned for. The state's first real attempt at a penitentiary in Columbus dates back to 1813, a modest jail holding only 13 cells, built for a frontier state that had not yet imagined how many people it would eventually need to lock up. It did not take long for that number to become laughably inadequate, as Ohio's population exploded across the early 19th century, and its court system began sending far more convicted men than a 13-cell facility could ever reasonably house. By 1834, the state had constructed a new facility along the banks of the Saito River, and in late October of that year, 189 prisoners were marched under guard from the old frontier jail to their new home, an unfinished building whose stone walls were still being completed even as its first inmates walked through the gate. Picture that procession for a moment, nearly 200 men in chains, walking along the riverbank toward a structure that was, quite literally, still under construction, its final form not yet decided, its walls rising around them even as they took up residence inside it. That image, men arriving to occupy a building before the builders had even finished it, would turn out to be almost prophetic, because the Ohio Penitentiary would spend the rest of its 150 years locked in exactly that same relationship with its own physical capacity, always slightly behind the number of people the state was sending it, always adding another wing, another wall, another expansion, and never quite catching up. That new institution, the Ohio Penitentiary, would go on to operate for 150 years, and almost from the beginning, it carried a reputation that had nothing to do with reform and everything to do with raw survival. The original complex was built on the western bank of the Scioto River, close enough to downtown Columbus that the growing capital city and the growing prison population expanded. For a century and a half, almost side by side, the the state's own seat of government and one of its most notorious penal institutions, separated by little more than a stretch of riverfront. The prison's stone walls, imposing and severe, even by the standards of 19th-century institutional architecture, projected exactly the kind of permanence and authority state officials of the era wanted a penitentiary to communicate to the public, an intended message of secure, orderly confinement that the building's actual, lived history would spend the next century and a half quietly contradicting. A women's wing was added by 1837, one of the earliest such facilities attached to a men's penitentiary anywhere in the country, and women continued to be held on the grounds until 1916, when Ohio finally opened a separate reformatory for its female prisoners, ending an arrangement that had, for nearly 80 years, held male and female inmates within the same walled complex, separated only by internal partitions rather than any real distance. In 1849, a cholera epidemic tore through the overcrowded facility and killed 121 convicts in a single outbreak, a death toll that would have constituted a serious public health crisis anywhere else in the state, and that barely registered as noteworthy inside a prison already accustomed to losing men to disease, to violence, and to the sheer physical toll of overcrowded confinement. Cholera thrives on exactly the conditions overcrowded 19th-century prisons routinely provided: contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, and large numbers of people packed into close quarters, with no meaningful way to isolate the sick from the healthy. The Ohio Penitentiary offered all three in abundance, and it would continue to do so for most of the century that followed. The 1849 epidemic arrived during a broader cholera pandemic sweeping across much of the United States that same year, a wave of disease that struck cities and institutions with poor sanitation infrastructure particularly hard, and the penitentiary's own closed, crowded population made it exactly the kind of environment in which the disease could spread fastest and kill most efficiently, with nowhere for a healthy man to retreat to and no functioning system to separate the infected from those who might still be saved. By 1893, a prison superintendent put the institution's own internal reality into words that have survived, in their bluntness, for more than a century. 10,000 pages of the Ohio Penitentiary's history, he wrote, would not give one idea of the inward wretchedness of its 1,900 inmates. The unwritten history, he said, is known only by God himself. That is not a critic writing from outside the walls. That is the man running the institution, on the record, telling the public that the actual, lived experience of incarceration inside his own facility was too dark to commit to paper. It is one of the more remarkable admissions this channel has ever come across from someone in a position of direct institutional authority, a superintendent effectively conceding, in his own official capacity, that no written record could ever adequately convey what his own prison actually did to the men living inside it. The Ohio Penitentiary also became, across its long operating history, the place where the state of Ohio carried out its executions, first by hanging and later by electric chair, continuing until Ohio abolished the death penalty in 1963. Ohio's electric chair, like the versions this channel has already documented at other state prisons, represented the same nationwide shift away from public hanging that swept through American corrections in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, moving capital punishment behind institutional walls and out of the public square, administered now by state employees rather than a county sheriff in front of an assembled crowd. Dozens of men were put to death inside these walls over the decades that Ohio's death penalty statute remained active, a grim, quiet counterpart running alongside everything else this same institution was simultaneously known for: the overcrowding, the disease outbreaks, and eventually the fire that would come to define its entire legacy above everything else it had ever done. And it held, over its 150 years, an almost improbable roster of genuinely famous inmates, a list that reads less like the population of a single American state prison, and more like a cross-section of an entire century of American notoriety. Confederate Cavalry General John Hunt Morgan was imprisoned there during the Civil War, captured after a notorious raid deep into Union territory that had taken his forces further north than almost any other Confederate unit managed to reach during the entire conflict. And he pulled off one of the most celebrated prison breaks in American history, tunneling out with several of his officers in 1863 in an escape, audacious enough that it became a piece of Civil War folklore in its own right, retold and embellished for generations afterward as a rare moment of Confederate triumph on Northern soil. Morgan and his men reportedly dug through the floor of their cells and into a ventilation tunnel beneath the prison, emerging on the outside of the walls in the dead of night before making their way south, a story that Confederate sympathizers seized on immediately as evidence that even the North's most secure prison could not hold a determined Southern officer, and that has remained one of the single most repeated anecdotes in the entire 150-year history of the institution. Morgan's escape occurred at a moment when Confederate military fortunes had already begun to turn against the South more broadly, and the story of a celebrated cavalry raider slipping out from under the Union's own capital city penitentiary offered exactly the kind of morale-boosting narrative the Confederacy badly needed, regardless of how little strategic significance the actual escape carried in the broader arc of the war. The Chicago mobster George Bugs Moran, associate and rival of Al Capone during the bloodiest years of Prohibition-era organized crime, served time within these same walls, one of the era's most recognizable gangland figures passing through a prison system that, by the time he arrived, had already been operating for the better part of a century. Moran's own criminal career, defined by his long-running turf war with Capone's organization, and his narrow survival of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, made him one of the most closely watched figures in American organized crime during that period, and his eventual imprisonment inside an Ohio state facility, far from the Chicago streets that had made his name, was itself treated as significant news at the time. Sam Shepard, the Ohio doctor whose murder conviction and eventual acquittal would go on to inspire the television series and film The Fugitive, was held here as well, his case one of the most sensationalized and closely followed criminal trials of mid-20th century America, a story of wrongful conviction and eventual vindication that has shaped the popular American imagination about the justice system for decades since. Shepard's original 1954 trial, and the extraordinary level of press coverage surrounding it, would later be cited by the United States Supreme Court itself, in a landmark ruling on pretrial publicity, as a textbook example of exactly how a media circus can compromise a defendant's right to a fair trial, making Shepard's time inside the Ohio Penitentiary part of a case that eventually reshaped American legal standards on criminal justice, and the press, entirely separate from anything to do with the prison building itself. And in the early 1900s, a bank embezzler and fugitive named William Sidney Porter served a 3-year sentence inside the Ohio Penitentiary, convicted of embezzling funds from a Texas bank where he had worked as a teller, a conviction Porter maintained for the rest of his life had been the result of sloppy bookkeeping rather than deliberate theft. It was here, using time behind bars to teach himself the craft, that he began publishing short stories under a pen name that would eventually become one of the most recognized in all of American literature, O. Henry. Porter wrote dozens of stories during his time inside these walls, developing the twist-ending style that would define his entire subsequent career, publishing under a pseudonym specifically so that his employers and the reading public would have no idea the celebrated new voice in American short fiction was, at that very moment, a convicted felon serving out a sentence for financial fraud. Some of his earliest published work moved from behind the Ohio Penitentiary's own walls directly into national magazines, sold under a name that concealed everything about the circumstances of its author, a genuinely remarkable act of literary invention carried out entirely inside a working 19th century American prison. But none of that history, not the cholera, not the escapes, not the famous names, prepared anyone for what was coming on a spring evening in 1930. Life inside the Ohio Penitentiary, in the years leading up to the fire, followed the same grinding pattern this channel has now documented, at institution after institution. Rigid daily schedules, communal meals, taken in a single vast dining hall, large enough to feed thousands of men at a sitting, and a population packed steadily tighter into cells and cell blocks that had never been meaningfully expanded to match the growth. The building's architecture, imposing multi-story cell blocks arranged around central corridors, had been designed in an earlier era with a very different population size in mind, and by the 1920s, that architecture was straining visibly under a population it could no longer comfortably hold. Consider what that arrangement actually did to the men living inside it. Reports from the period describe men bunked 2 and 3 to cells originally built for 1, guards stretched thin across a facility whose population had outgrown its staffing decades earlier, and an institution that had, in every practical sense, been running on borrowed time for years before anyone lit a single match. Every one of the specific vulnerabilities that would make the coming fire so catastrophic: insufficient staff to manage an emergency, a locked population with nowhere to flee, cells clustered so tightly that a single localized disaster could threaten hundreds of men at once, had already been quietly accumulating for years, waiting only for the right spark. If this is landing the way it landed on all of us here while researching it, subscribing helps more people find it. By 1930, the overcrowding that had defined the Ohio Penitentiary since its very first decade had reached a genuinely staggering scale. The institution had been designed and built to hold roughly 1,500 men. On the night of April 21st, it held approximately 4,300, nearly 3 times its intended capacity, a number that had been climbing for years under the pressure of mandatory minimum sentencing laws that gave judges almost no discretion to send lower-level offenders anywhere other than directly into an already overwhelmed state prison system. Those mandatory sentencing statutes had been passed with the ordinary political logic of the era, a promise to voters that the state would be tough on crime, with essentially no consideration given to whether the physical infrastructure existed to actually hold the resulting population. Judges who might otherwise have exercised discretion, sending a minor offender to probation or a shorter local sentence, had that option removed by law, and the Ohio Penitentiary absorbed the consequences of that policy, decade after decade, year after year, until it was holding nearly 3 men for every one it had been built to house. Construction crews were actively working to expand part of the facility to relieve some of that pressure, and on the evening the fire broke out, scaffolding built from freshly cut, green lumber ran along the roof of the prison's 6-story west block, directly above cells already packed well beyond their intended occupancy. Green lumber, wood that has not been properly seasoned or dried, is considerably more flammable in certain conditions than fully cured timber, and it produces markedly more smoke when it burns, 2 facts that would prove catastrophically relevant within the hour. The fire itself began with almost absurd simplicity for an event that would go on to kill more people than almost any building fire in American history. A candle, deliberately placed inside a pan of kerosene, was tucked into a pile of oily rags left on that same scaffolded roof. It ignited sometime around 4:30 in the afternoon, and then it simply smoldered, low and largely unnoticed, for close to an hour, exactly long enough for the entire evening prison routine to unfold as if nothing at all were wrong. There is something genuinely chilling about that hour of delay, a full 60 minutes, in which the mechanism of the deadliest prison fire in American history was already quietly burning, unseen, while hundreds of men went about the last ordinary evening of their lives, completely unaware of what was smoldering on the roof directly above their heads. Roughly 800 inmates housed in the affected cell blocks were marched to the dining hall for their evening meal, ate, and were marched back to their cells, and it was only after they had been locked in for the night, sometime around 5:30, that a passerby outside the walls first spotted the flames and raised the alarm. Those men walked back into their cells, were locked in by guards following an entirely ordinary evening procedure, and had no idea that the very routine meant to secure them for the night was, in fact, sealing them into the exact structure that was about to become a death trap. The mundane, procedural nature of that lockup, the same bolts turned, the same keys withdrawn, the same nightly check performed thousands of times before without incident, is precisely what makes it so difficult to comprehend in retrospect. Nothing about that evening felt, to the men living through its opening moments, any different from any other night at the Ohio Penitentiary. The specific timing of that combustion has never been fully settled, and it sits at the center of a question this channel needs to answer carefully rather than simply repeat as fact, because it shapes everything that follows. Prison officials, in the aftermath, publicly attributed the fire to 3 specific inmates, whom they said had planted the smoldering candle deliberately, timed to erupt while the population was still in the dining hall, hoping the resulting chaos and diverted guard attention would let them slip away during the confusion of an evacuation. The plan, as officials described it, depended entirely on precise timing, on the fire catching and spreading, while guards and prisoners alike were preoccupied with the disorder of several thousand men moving between the mess hall and their cell blocks, a window of confusion that a handful of determined men might plausibly use to simply walk away from the institution amid the chaos. The fire, on this theory, was arson, and its true purpose was never the mass casualty event it became, but a cover for an escape attempt that simply miscalculated its own timing by roughly an hour, catching hundreds of men locked back in their cells instead of scattered and unsupervised in the yard. The evidence prison officials pointed to in support of that theory arrived, grimly, in the months that followed. 2 of the 3 men they had accused took their own lives before the matter could ever be tested in a courtroom, a fact the administration treated as tacit confirmation of guilt. It is worth pausing on how thin that particular chain of reasoning actually is, even as it has hardened, in most popular retellings of this story, into settled fact. 2 men dying by suicide after being publicly named as responsible for the deadliest prison fire in American history, under intense pressure from fellow inmates, guards, and a horrified public, is consistent with guilt. It is also consistent with the crushing weight of being falsely accused of killing 322 people and having no realistic path to clearing your name inside a system that had already decided the answer. But that is not the only version of events that surfaced at the time, and it is worth stating plainly that the arson theory has never been definitively, independently proven beyond the state's own account of it. A competing explanation, taken seriously by contemporaries and by later historians examining the case, held that the fire was simply an accident, sparked by ordinary carelessness around active construction work, oily rags, and open flame in close proximity to freshly cut, highly combustible green lumber, and that Ohio's prison administration seized on the convenient narrative of an inmate conspiracy specifically to draw attention away from its own catastrophic failures, the overcrowding it had allowed to reach nearly 3 times capacity, the total absence of any functioning fire safety protocol, and the guards' own decisions once the smoke began pouring into the cell blocks. A story about 3 vengeful or desperate inmates plotting an escape is, after all, a considerably more comfortable story for a state government to tell the public than a story about a prison system so poorly managed that an ordinary construction accident was allowed to kill more people than almost any fire in the nation's history. An accident, however tragic, is a story about bad luck. A conspiracy is a story about villains who deserved what eventually happened to them. Only one of those two stories requires the state itself to answer difficult questions about its own oversight, its own staffing, and its own complete failure to prepare for exactly this kind of emergency. Two men who died by suicide in the aftermath of a national catastrophe that had just claimed over 300 lives is evidence that deserves serious weight, but it is not, on its own, proof beyond any reasonable doubt of exactly what those three men did or did not do on that scaffolded rooftop. And honest history has to hold both possibilities rather than collapse the story into whichever version is more dramatic. This channel has, at other institutions, encountered official narratives that turned out to be wrong, and official narratives that turned out to be broadly correct. And the honest answer here, unlike some of those other cases, is that neither side of this particular dispute has ever produced conclusive proof strong enough to settle the question definitively, more than 90 years after the fact, with the original investigators, witnesses, and accused men all long since dead. What can be said with total confidence, regardless of which explanation eventually turns out to be correct, is that a fire this deadly should never have been possible inside any properly run institution in the first place, arson or accident, and that the state's own catastrophic overcrowding and its complete absence of fire safety planning are what actually turned a rooftop fire into the deadliest prison disaster in American history. Whether three men lit that candle on purpose or a construction worker simply left it burning too close to a pile of oily rags, changes very little about the actual chain of institutional failure that turned a single small flame into 322 deaths. What is not in dispute, from any account, official or otherwise, is what happened once the smoke reached the cell blocks, and that is the part of this story that has actually defined its place in American history ever since. As flames spread across the roof and thick smoke began pouring down through the tiers of the West Block, the 800 men locked inside began screaming and begging to be released from their cells. The guards on duty, holding the keys that would have let every one of those men out in a matter of minutes, largely refused to unlock the doors. Their stated fear, repeated consistently in the accounts that followed, was that opening the cells would trigger a mass escape, that hundreds of prisoners suddenly released into a chaotic, smoke-filled building represented a security catastrophe the institution could not risk, even as the alternative meant leaving those same men locked inside a building actively filling with lethal smoke. Sit with the actual arithmetic of that decision for a moment, because it is the single detail that has kept this fire in public memory for nearly a century. A guard standing at the end of a cell block, key in hand, weighed the certain ongoing deaths of hundreds of locked, defenseless men against the mere possibility that some undetermined number of those same men might, if freed, attempt to flee into the surrounding city. He chose to protect against the possibility rather than prevent the certainty. Multiply that single calculation across dozens of guards making the same choice, block after block, minute after minute, while the smoke thickened, and you arrive at the specific mechanism by which this fire killed as many people as it did. Not the flames themselves, not even the collapsing roof, but a series of individual, human decisions to leave locked doors locked. It is worth asking what training, if any, those guards had actually received to prepare them for a decision of that magnitude, and the honest answer, by every account of the period, is essentially none. 1930s American Corrections offered its frontline staff almost no formal instruction in emergency response, no established protocol weighing security risk against loss of life, and no clear chain of command specifying who actually had the authority to override standing security procedure in a genuine crisis. Each guard standing at each locked cell block that evening was, in effect, left to make an enormously consequential decision entirely on his own judgment, under conditions of smoke, noise, and screaming that would have made calm, considered reasoning extraordinarily difficult for almost anyone, with no institutional guidance whatsoever to draw on beyond the general, standing instruction to prevent escapes at all costs. It is important to be fair to the men who wore that uniform that night. Some guards did break from that pattern, defying orders or their own instincts to begin freeing prisoners as the situation worsened, and their names deserve to be remembered alongside everyone else's in this story, rather than erased by the failure of their colleagues. Individual acts of genuine courage happened inside that burning building, guards who made the opposite calculation and paid for it in scorched lungs and singed uniforms, rather than in a clean conscience bought at the cost of other men's lives. But the dominant, documented response across most of the affected block was refusal, and it is the reason this fire killed as many people as it did. The building's own construction turned that refusal into a mass death sentence. Most of the men who died did not die from direct exposure to flame. They died from smoke inhalation, poisoned by fumes generated in large part by that same freshly cut, green construction lumber burning on the roof directly above them, filling a sealed cell block with toxic air that had nowhere to escape and that the locked men had no way to flee. A cell built for confinement is, by design, a poor place to survive a fire. Solid walls, a single barred opening, no alternative exit, no ventilation beyond whatever the building's original architects considered adequate for ordinary daily use, rather than a mass toxic smoke event. Men who might have survived the same fire in an open room, able to move toward a window or a door, had no such option available to them at all. They could only stand or sit inside a stone and iron box, breathing whatever air the fire above them was pushing down through the tiers, waiting for either rescue or death, with absolutely no ability to influence which one arrived first. And then the roof itself, weakened by the fire consuming the very scaffolding built to support ongoing repairs, collapsed inward onto the upper tier of cells, killing roughly 160 men outright in a single structural failure, crushed and burned inside cells they had never been allowed to leave. That single collapse accounts for very nearly half of the fire's entire death toll. A single catastrophic structural failure, landing directly on top of men who had already spent the preceding hour begging, without success, to be let out of the exact space that was about to fall in on them. A small number of men did manage to escape their fate through sheer improvised action, rather than any institutional mercy. Roughly 50 inmates got out of their cells before the smoke became too thick to continue any organized evacuation, and at least one small group of prisoners, finding themselves unlocked amid the chaos, overpowered a guard, seized his keys, and ran directly back into the burning cell block to free as many other men as they physically could, carrying the injured, dragging the unconscious, working against a fire that was actively killing the very people they were trying to save. Contemporary accounts describe these rescue efforts continuing, even as conditions inside the block grew steadily more dangerous, men returning again and again into thickening smoke to pull out anyone still capable of being moved. A grim, improvised triage carried out entirely by the prisoners themselves, with no formal authority, no equipment beyond a single stolen ring of keys, and no guarantee whatsoever that their own next trip back into the smoke would not be their last. Consider what that decision actually required of the men who made it. Having just secured their own escape from a burning, collapsing building, they chose to run back into it, armed with nothing but a stolen set of keys, to open as many more doors as time and breathable air would allow. An act of raw courage carried out by incarcerated men that the institution holding them had never trained, equipped, or authorized them to perform. These were men the state of Ohio had classified as dangerous enough to lock behind stone walls and iron bars, And in the single worst moment of crisis this institution ever faced, it was precisely those same men, not the guards employed and trained to protect the population, who ran toward the fire rather than away from it. A fact that says something quietly devastating about where genuine courage and genuine institutional failure actually resided that evening, regardless of which side of the bars each man happened to be standing on. Outside the walls, the scene had already spiraled into its own separate crisis. As word of the fire and the resulting chaos spread through Columbus, roughly 500 armed soldiers were called in from nearby Fort Hays, arriving with machine guns and loaded rifles, positioned not to fight the fire, but to prevent any mass breakout the burning building might produce. That detail alone tells you exactly where the state's institutional priorities remained, even as the disaster unfolded in real time. The response to a fire that was actively killing hundreds of locked, defenseless men was to summon armed soldiers to guard against the prisoners, rather than firefighters and rescue personnel focused purely on saving lives. Crowds of terrified family members gathered outside the walls, desperate for any word of their relatives inside, and guards had to raise those same weapons to hold back the growing throng pressing toward the gates. Mothers and wives and children standing in the street outside a burning prison, watching smoke rise into the evening sky over Columbus, and having absolutely no way of knowing whether the person they loved was alive, injured, or already among the dead. Warden P.E. Thomas, managing a disaster of a scale no American prison administrator had ever faced, allowed a single reporter from each newspaper through the gates that night, telling them bluntly to be quick and to be careful. That instruction alone captures something of the surreal position Thomas found himself in that evening, simultaneously managing an active mass casualty fire, coordinating with hundreds of armed soldiers positioned around his own institution, and fielding the demands of a press corps that understood, correctly, that they were witnessing history unfold in the worst possible way. Telegrams and telephone calls poured in through the night and into the following day. Family after family lined up for word of whether their son, husband, or brother had survived. Radio stations broadcast updates promising that word would come soon for every prisoner confirmed safe. An entire city listening to its local airwaves for confirmation that a family member locked inside a burning state institution had, against considerable odds, lived through the night. A scene of mass public anxiety playing out across an entire metropolitan area in real time, decades before anyone would have described it using that particular phrase. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, 322 men were dead, and roughly 230 more were injured seriously enough to require hospitalization, numbers that made the Ohio Penitentiary fire, in that single evening, the deadliest prison fire in the recorded history of the United States, a distinction it would hold, tragically, for more than 80 years, until a fire in a Honduran prison in 2012 finally surpassed its death toll. One of the 800 men locked inside that cell block that evening was a young writer named Chester Himes, serving a sentence for armed robbery, who would go on to become one of the most significant American novelists of the 20th century, celebrated for a body of crime fiction that would eventually influence generations of writers working in the genre. Himes survived the fire, and years later, once he had established himself as a serious literary voice, he wrote directly about what he had witnessed that night, in a piece published in Esquire magazine under the title, To What Red Hell. What makes Himes's account genuinely striking, according to those who have studied his broader body of work, is what it does not dwell on. Himes would go on to build an entire celebrated career writing unflinchingly about race in America, producing some of the sharpest and most unsparing crime fiction of his era, specifically because he refused to look away from exactly the kinds of injustice this channel spends its own time documenting. But his account of the Ohio Penitentiary fire largely sets that lens aside. Instead, he wrote about something closer to the raw architecture of human behavior under absolute terror. The fear, the cowardice, the sudden and unexpected bravery, the desperate hope, and the plain animal will to survive that he watched play out around him in real time, inside a locked cell, while men were burning and suffocating within arm's reach of doors nobody would open. It stands as one of the only first-hand literary accounts of the disaster, written by someone who actually lived through it from inside a cell, rather than reconstructed afterward from official reports and newspaper coverage. And that distinction matters enormously to how this story has been passed down. Every other account of April 21, 1930, comes from outside the walls. A reporter allowed briefly through the gates, a warden's public statement, a fire marshal's official report, a historian piecing together records decades later. Hymes's account is the rare exception, the testimony of a man who was, at that exact moment, locked inside one of those cells himself, listening to the same screaming, breathing the same smoke, waiting to find out whether his own door would be the one that opened in time. The reckoning that followed the fire was swift, at least by the standards of American institutional accountability, and it produced changes that reshaped both Ohio's prison system and, eventually, fire safety standards for correctional facilities nationwide. Within weeks of the disaster, 3 separate investigations were launched simultaneously, one by the state fire marshal, one by the Ohio Attorney General's office, and one ordered directly by the governor, each examining a different angle of exactly how a building holding nearly 3,000 more people than it was designed for had been allowed to reach that point, and exactly why guards had chosen to leave men locked inside a burning structure rather than risk opening the doors. 3 separate state bodies investigating the same disaster simultaneously is itself a measure of how thoroughly the fire had shocked Ohio's own government. Disasters of this scale rarely produce even one serious inquiry, let alone 3 running in parallel. The most consequential response was legislative rather than criminal. In 1931, the Ohio legislature repealed a set of mandatory minimum sentencing laws that judges and reformers had already identified as a primary driver of the prison's catastrophic overcrowding. Laws that had stripped judges of the discretion to consider alternatives to imprisonment, even for comparatively minor offenses. That repeal represented a genuine reversal of the state's own prior tough-on-crime policy, an acknowledgement, only a year after the fire, that the same laws lawmakers had passed to project strength against crime had directly contributed to the deaths of 322 people locked inside cells they could not escape. That same year, the state created the Ohio Parole Board, establishing formal procedures that allowed the early release of prisoners who no longer posed a genuine risk to public safety, a direct institutional response to a fire whose death toll had been amplified, by every serious account, precisely because the building held nearly 3 times the number of men it had ever been built to safely contain. By 1932, that new parole process had released 2,346 prisoners from Ohio's system, a single-year reduction in the state's incarcerated population, larger than the entire designed capacity of the penitentiary that had just burned. Put another way, in the space of a single year following the fire, Ohio released more prisoners through its new parole mechanism than the original building had ever been intended to hold in the first place, a genuinely remarkable measure of just how far state policy had allowed the prison's population to drift from anything resembling a safe or sustainable capacity. The fire's influence extended well beyond Ohio's own borders. In the years that followed, it became a foundational case study behind the development of formal fire safety codes for correctional facilities across the entire United States, one of the clearest and most tragic illustrations available of what happens when a building housing thousands of confined, physically restrained people has no functioning emergency evacuation protocol at all. Fire officials and correctional administrators studying the disaster in the years afterward identified a specific set of failures that had compounded one another. No coordinated evacuation plan for a locked population. No protocol distinguishing between the risk of a mass escape and the certainty of mass death by smoke inhalation. No training for guards on how to weigh those two very different risks against each other in the crucial first minutes of an emergency, and no fire-resistant standards governing what materials could be used in ongoing construction directly above occupied cell blocks. Before 1930, American prisons had, in general, treated fire safety as an afterthought, at best, a minor administrative concern subordinate to the far more central institutional priority of preventing escape. The Ohio Penitentiary disaster forced a genuine reordering of those priorities, at least on paper, across the entire national correctional system. Architects and administrators who designed and ran prisons in the decades that followed were, for the first time, required to seriously grapple with a question that had barely registered before 1930. What happens to a locked, confined population in the event of a fire? And what physical and procedural systems need to exist in advance to keep that population from dying inside cells they cannot open themselves? It is a genuinely basic question, one that seems almost too obvious to need stating, and yet the historical record shows plainly that American prisons operated for the better part of a century without any serious systematic answer to it, right up until 322 men died, finding out the hard way. Those reforms measurably worked. Fires inside American prisons and jails, once a recurring and often deadly hazard, declined steadily in both frequency and lethality over the following decades. By the early 2000s, the entire national count of serious prison and jail fires in a given year had fallen to single digits, a direct, traceable legacy of the specific failures documented at the Ohio Penitentiary on a single evening in 1930. It is a genuinely rare thing for this channel to be able to say about any of the institutions it covers, that the deaths documented here produced a body of concrete, measurable, lasting reform that has demonstrably saved lives in the decades since. At facilities the men who died in Columbus never lived to see built. The Ohio Penitentiary itself did not close in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. It continued operating for more than 5 decades afterward, through further riots, including outbreaks of violence in 1931 and again in 1968, disturbances that suggested the underlying tensions the fire had briefly forced the state to address, overcrowding chief among them, had never been fully resolved, even after the parole reforms of the early 1930s. The 1931 riot, coming barely a year after the fire itself, is a particularly striking data point. It means that even with the legislature actively repealing mandatory sentencing laws and the newly created parole board actively releasing thousands of men, the underlying institutional tension inside the Ohio Penitentiary had not cooled enough to prevent a full-scale disturbance within 12 months of the deadliest disaster in its history. Population pressure eased for a period following the mass releases of 1932. But Ohio's prison system, like nearly every state system this channel has documented, proved unable to sustain that relief indefinitely. And by 1955, the Ohio Penitentiary had climbed back to a peak population of 5,235 men, a number that made the overcrowding present on the night of the fire look almost modest by comparison. The 1968 riot, arriving more than a generation later, is a reminder of just how durable the underlying pressures inside an overcrowded American prison can be, resurfacing across decades and multiple generations of administrators, no matter how thoroughly any single reform effort claims to have solved the problem. And through its own later chapter of controversial medical research, when a virologist named Chester Southam injected inmates with live cancer cells during the 1950s as part of a study on immune response, a program the researchers themselves later acknowledged carried a real risk of actually causing the disease in the men being tested. The same underlying pattern of captive, coerced human experimentation This channel has already documented in detail at Willowbrook and at Holmesburg, playing out here as well, on a smaller scale, inside the very walls that had burned a generation earlier. Southam's broader research program extended well beyond the Ohio Penitentiary alone, drawing on other vulnerable and institutionalized populations across the country, including elderly hospital patients who were similarly not properly informed about what was actually being injected into their bodies. But the presence of his work inside these same walls is a reminder of how consistently, across mid-20th century America, a prison population was treated by outside researchers as a convenient and available source of human test subjects, regardless of which specific institution happened to be holding them at the time, and regardless of whether that same institution had, within living memory, already killed hundreds of its own residents through nothing more than basic administrative and safety failure. The prison finally closed for good in 1984. Its remaining population transferred to newer facilities, including the maximum security complex built to replace it at Lucasville in the southern part of the state, a modern institution designed, at least on paper, with the fire safety lessons of 1930 explicitly in mind. The state sold the property to the city of Columbus in 1995, and in 1998, 164 years after the first 189 prisoners walked through its gates, the entire Ohio Penitentiary complex was demolished. 164 years of continuous operation, spanning a cholera epidemic, a Confederate general's tunnel escape, one of America's most celebrated short story writers serving a felony sentence, a virologist injecting inmates with cancer cells, and the deadliest prison fire in the country's history. He ended not with a court order or a dramatic closure, but with a wrecking crew clearing the ground for redevelopment, the same quiet, bureaucratic anticlimax that has defined so much of how this specific chapter of American history has ultimately been handled. What stands on that ground today bears no visible trace of what happened there. The site is now the heart of what Columbus calls the Arena District, home to Nationwide Arena, home ice for the city's professional hockey team, surrounded by restaurants, apartments, and the ordinary bustle of a modern downtown entertainment district. The transformation is genuinely total. Where a stone-walled fortress once held thousands of men in cramped, overcrowded cells, there are now sports bars, condominium towers, and outdoor patios filled on any given evening with people out for dinner or heading to a game, entirely unaware of what the ground beneath their feet once was. The district's own marketing describes it as one of the most vibrant entertainment corridors in the entire Midwest, a neighborhood built around leisure, spending, and the ordinary pleasures of a night out, existing in almost perfect inversion of what occupied the same footprint for 150 years, an overcrowded, underfunded state institution, defined by confinement, disease, and, on one specific evening in 1930, mass death by fire and smoke. Nothing about the glass and steel of a hockey arena or the outdoor patios of the restaurants around it suggests, at a glance, that 322 men once burned or suffocated to death on this exact patch of ground, locked into cells they were never let out of. A single historical marker, mounted on a rock wall somewhere within the district, carries an account and a handful of images of the old penitentiary, the closest thing the neighborhood offers to a physical acknowledgement of what this ground actually is. It is easy to walk past that marker without ever reading it, a small plaque among the signage and storefronts of an entertainment district built explicitly around forgetting what came before it, a neighborhood whose entire commercial identity depends on visitors experiencing the space as new, clean, and unburdened by its own history. Developers building an entertainment district do not typically choose to foreground the fact that their restaurants and bars sit atop the site of the deadliest prison fire in the nation's history, and Columbus's own Arena District, whatever informational marker it does include, was never designed as a memorial in the way the Willowbrook Mile or Moundsville's museum tours were. Most of the tens of thousands of people who pass through the arena district every year, heading to a hockey game or a concert or dinner with friends, have no reason to know that marker exists at all, let alone what it commemorates. A person could live in Columbus for years, attend dozens of games at Nationwide Arena, eat at half the restaurants lining the surrounding blocks, and never once learn that they were standing, repeatedly, on the exact ground where the deadliest prison fire in American history took place, where guards stood at the ends of locked cell blocks and chose, in the critical first minutes, not to use the keys already in their hands. That is, in its own way, a genuinely different ending than most of the institutions this channel has documented. There is no ghost tour here, no preserved cell block open for overnight visitors, no abandoned ruin slowly returning to the earth for photographers to wander through. The building itself is entirely gone, replaced so completely that an ordinary visitor could stand on the exact spot where the West Block's roof collapsed onto 160 burning men and never know it. Compare that to the institutions this channel has documented that were left standing. Moundsville with its 30,000 annual paying visitors. Parchman still farmed and still operating. Willowbrook's grounds turned into a college campus with a deliberate memorial trail. In every one of those cases, something physical remains, some structure, or scar, or marker that forces the present to reckon, at least occasionally, with the past. The Ohio Penitentiary offers none of that. It was not preserved as a memorial and was not left to decay as a monument. It was simply erased, and a professional hockey arena was built directly on top of where it stood, a form of forgetting that requires no haunted house marketing at all, because there is, quite literally, nothing left standing to haunt. 322 men died, in total, because a prison built for 1,500 people held nearly 3 times that number, because a construction crew's scaffolding and green lumber turned a smoldering candle into a lethal firestorm, and because, when the smoke started pouring into their cells, the men holding the keys chose, in that critical first stretch of minutes, not to use them. Whatever started that fire, an escape attempt gone wrong, or a careless accident on an active construction site, the decision that turned it into the deadliest prison fire in American history was made afterward, by guards standing at the ends of locked cell blocks, weighing the small chance of a handful of men escaping into the Columbus night against the certain deaths of hundreds of men who could not open their own doors. History has settled, with total confidence, on exactly one part of that story. The fire may or may not have been set on purpose. The doors, everyone agrees, stayed locked on purpose, for just long enough. Ohio's own institutions responded to that fact within a year, repealing the sentencing laws that had crammed nearly 3 times as many men into that building as it was ever meant to hold, and creating a parole system that released more prisoners in a single year than the entire penitentiary had originally been built to house. Fire codes changed. Prison design changed, nationwide, for decades afterward. Chester Himes walked out of that fire and eventually told the world what it had actually looked like from inside a locked cell. And the building itself, in the end, was simply removed from the earth, replaced by a hockey arena and a strip of restaurants, leaving nothing standing for anyone to visit, to tour, or to be haunted by, except a single marker on a rock wall that most people walking past it will never stop to read. Every other institution this channel has documented left something behind. A stone facade at Moundsville that still draws 30,000 paying visitors a year. Cotton fields at Parchman still worked by hand. A college campus at Willowbrook built specifically to keep teaching its own worst chapter out loud. The Ohio Penitentiary left almost nothing at all, a single plaque in an entertainment district, and the fact that this particular disaster, the deadliest prison fire in the entire history of the United States, has faded so completely from public memory that most residents of the very city built around its former grounds have never heard of it, says something genuinely important about how selectively America chooses to remember its own institutional failures. The scandals that leave a haunted building behind get toured. The ones that get demolished and paved over get forgotten. And 322 men, locked in cells they could not open, on ground now covered by a professional hockey rink, are exactly the kind of history that erasure was built to produce. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know exactly what this channel is about and what it stands for. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the next deep dive. We cover a different forgotten institution every single week, without fail, and every single one of them has a story the rest of the internet forgot. Whether that story is still standing behind a locked gate or has already been paved over and forgotten entirely. We'll see you inside, wherever the next set of locked doors turns out to actually be, in a building history has chosen to remember, or one it has already tried its best to forget.